Hello everyone, welcome you to Inspire Together YouTube channel, and I'm your host Muinuddin Bashar. This is the first session of Microsoft Azure course where I will introduce you to Microsoft Azure concepts and how Azure works. In today's lesson, we will be looking at cloud concepts, and specifically we will be looking at the benefits and the consideration of using cloud services. In this lesson, we will be looking at three concepts that each tie together to provide numerous advantages to using cloud computing, and those three concepts are high availability, fault tolerance, and disaster recovery. So let's start by taking a look at the interactive diagram on the right side of my screen. We will go through each of these three concepts and make sure that we know what each one of them means and how they can each help us to achieve the best possible applications and systems as we go through these concepts. Let's try to think about each one in terms of what it would cost us to replicate in our own data centers instead of using Azure. So, on the diagram on the right part of my screen, we will start with high availability, which already should be selected, and high availability is the ability to maintain an acceptable continuous performance despite temporary load failures in services, hardware or data centers. And the key point here is to maintain acceptable continuous performance, which is in bold, and that means that even if traffic varies to our side, if it increases greatly or decreases greatly, or in fact if certain Azure services fail, if some hardware fails, or in fact if an entire data center fails, to our applications and systems can still maintain acceptable continuous performance. And so let's take a look at how Azure does that, and it's based on redundancies at every level. So we'll start at the finest level, which is a single individual data center within Azure, and we will look at the redundancies employed where to make sure that everything stays up as much as possible. First off, with power. The power system in this Azure data center are fully redundant. It's not uncommon for a data center to be able to generate its own power, and as well as there might be different providers of power coming into the data center. So if one has an interruption, the other stays up. And there's also redundancies in power generation, the power battery backups, and systems like that. There's also redundancies with the cooling systems. They might use a combination of different cooling approaches like water cooling and air cooling, and they might have redundancies as well with the providers that they use to power and to fuel those cooling systems, and additionally with the networking equipment like switches, routers, and other networking hardware. All of those are fully redundant. And Azure data center as well, and in fact there might be multiple internet service providers coming into data center as well. So again, if one is actually down or has an interruption, the other one can stay up and service the needs of data center. So within an Azure data center, there's redundancies at nearly every level, but in case something happens to an entire data center, we can step up a level from the data center and go to availability zones and read even more redundancies there. So an availability zone is essentially a grouping of one or more data centers put together. And in this capacity, you can deploy your apps and your systems to multiple different availability zones. For example, let's say we deploy to 2 availability zones if a data center and one availability goes down, we still might be deployed to a second data center in that same availability zones, and our applications and system can stay up now. Moving to higher level, what happens if an entire availability zone somehow goes down through either a natural disaster or some sort of emergency? Well, the higher level up from availability zone is region, and a region encompasses multiple availability zones put together. In fact, let's take a look at the left side of my screen. And we can see on Microsoft sites that Azure has 54 regions worldwide, and at the time of this filming, and it's available in 170 countries around the world. So pretty much no matter where you are in the world, you are most likely pretty close to an Azure region, if not directly in one. And at the very least, you should have access to the Azure cloud for your business. Now it's a region groups multiple availability zones put together, and that's kind of reflected in the image at the bottom of the interactive diagram. On the left, we see a fictitious region 1, and we see 3 availability zones, 1, 2 and 3. 1, 2 and 3. Within each one of those, we see 2 data centers, and you can kind of see now how the redundancies stack together, again starting from the data center level. There's multiple redundancies, and all the utilities and the infrastructure at the data center. But if something were to happen to a single data center, if we have deployed 2 availability zones, our application and system may still be in a second data center that's not affected, and keep up and running likewise if some sort of accident or disaster happen that affects an entire availability zone. We have the option to deploy our apps and systems across multiple availability zones, so even if one goes down, the data center in the other availability zones can pick up the stack and continue to host our applications and systems, and we will stay up and running. And finally, in an entire region somehow goes down, all the availability zones and all the data centers in the region, we can take advantage of using multiple regions within Azure. So if, for example, East US goes down and because of some freak accident, we could also be deployed in West US, and none of our applications or systems would actually go down because our second region would pick up the load. And so it's pretty powerful way through all these redundancies for Azure to maintain acceptable continuous performance despite any of these fluctuations in load or failures. Now the next thing we will look at is fault tolerance. And this refers to a system's ability to continue to operate properly when one or more of its components fail. And there's really 2 ways that we can look at becoming fault tolerant. We can use proactive options, and we can use reactive options. So starting with proactive, some proactive ways to handle faults when they occur to make sure our systems continue operating properly are to regularly back up our data, apps, and our resources. And the way if something does happen, we are ready to restore them as needed and get back up and running. We can also deploy to multiple availability zones or regions, like I mentioned earlier, to make sure that if one availability zones or region goes down, our system are in other one and they will stay up because of that. Now, when we do that, we can also load balance across multiple availability zones. So even if one does go down, our traffic will automatically be rerouted to the availability zone or region that's up, and it will be transparent to us, and we won't see any failures because of that. And finally, we can monitor the health of our data apps and resources to anticipate any problems and to handle them as quickly as possible. So these are approaches that we can take before a fault actually happens to make sure that we can recover from it as soon as possible, and some of these options are outright mitigate any errors because they spread our applications across different regions. So they are in at least one area that's not affected. Now let's look at reactive approaches. If something does happen that takes our systems offline, we can react to that to get our apps up as quickly as possible. And one way we can do that is to restore our data apps and resources to a different environment, like a different availability zone or a region. And that way we will get back up and running as quickly as possible as well. If one of our availability zones or regions is down, we can simply target a different availability zone or region and deploy our assets there, and again be back up and running as quickly as possible. So with Azure, there's a few mechanisms in place to either try to avoid failures in the first place, like deploying to multiple availability zones or regions, as well as when a fault happens to be able to recover from it as quickly as possible using backups and restoring them. And that kind of ways into our next topic, which is disaster recovery, and that is systems ability to back up and restore data apps and resources when needed. And we can do this in a variety of ways. If we have on-premise data centers, like in the image at the bottom of the diagram, let's say A and B, we can restore all of our backups of our data apps and resources in Azure, and we can restore from our data center A to our data center B using Azure as a middleman just to store the copies of our backed up data. So in that way, we can restore from on-premises to on-premises data centers also. We can take a different approach in our data center. As it goes out, we can store our backups and Azure immediately restore to Azure. And in that capacity, we will be restoring from on-premises data centers to Azure Cloud data centers additionally. If our assets are in a different cloud, such as AWS, we can store the backups of our data apps and resources in Azure and can restore to Azure. And in that capacity, we can restore from other cloud services directly to Azure. And finally, if our applications already in live in Azure, we can keep all of our backups inside of Azure as well, ideally in multiple different regions for protection. And in the case of an outage in one region or availability zone, we can just deploy to a second region or availability zone within Azure. And in that way, we are restoring from Azure to Azure. So as you can see, there are a couple of different ways we can accomplish disaster recovery when a disaster does strike, whether it's to our own data center, another cloud service data center, or an Azure data center. We have the available options we need in order to restore our services and get them back up and running. So one last thing before we finish out this video. There is a link in the description of this video, and I encourage you to check it out. It is a really cool video that Microsoft put out that gives you a tour of an actual Azure data center. So if you would like to go ahead and click in the link, you will click on the little green man that starts at the front door, and when we do that, it will go into a video section that has a couple of different sections going over everything we just talked about. We will start at the lobby. We will move to server room, which we can see here on the screen. They will go over all the cooling system they use in the Azure data center, as well as the power systems and how they keep everything modular. It's a really cool video, and I like to encourage you to check it out if you would like to learn a little bit more about these redundancies and how they keep up as your data centers up and online as much as possible. So if you have the time, check it out, whether that's going to warp it up for the lessons. I hope you learned something, and I hope you had fun practicing. If you would like, go ahead and grab a quick break, and I will see you in the next lesson. Thank you.